In the near future, not immediately, certainly not today and not this year even, but in the next few years, China wants to make it clear that it has the military capacity to be able to launch a blockade or even possibly, ultimately, an invasion of Taiwan. The reason it wants to signal this is not because it actually wants to make a military assault its first priority, but rather to try and force political talks along the lines preferable to Beijing. In other words, it wants to make it absolutely clear that there's no prospect of Taiwan becoming an independent state. But beyond that, I think it wants to pressure Taiwan's very lively democracy into essentially accepting unification on terms that are much more comfortable for China.
I mean, if we think back to Nancy Pelosi's visit, the response from Beijing then was a lot more intense, you might say. Has it been a little watered down this time because Tsai Ing-wen, actually went to the United States as opposed to a US official coming to Taiwan?
Yes, there's a little bit of a ballet going on here. Essentially, the reaction today is strong from the Chinese military. We see that from those aerial drills, but it's not as strong as it was last August when Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the US House, visited Taiwan directly. And the fact that Tsai Ing-wen went to the United States is still being slammed by the Chinese side as unacceptable, but their response has been a bit more measured in that sense. It's also worth noting that the former president of Taiwan, the Kuomintang or nationalist Ma Ying-jeou, has been visiting the mainland ostensibly to go and visit his ancestors' graves, but also as I think an attempt to try and show that the Taiwan opposition is in more of a position to have some sort of discussion with the mainland than the current government. So all of that's happening at the same time.
I mean, how important is timing in all of this? Because, of course, there are presidential elections in Taiwan in not too far in the future, equally in the United States as well. Is that likely to weigh into China's calculations about how to, move forward on the issue of Taiwan?
Beijing, I think, is calculating very carefully what's happening in those two crucial elections you mentioned. January 2024, much less than a year away, really only about 9 months, there's going to be a presidential election. If the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen's party, win, but with a different candidate because she's term limited, she can't stand again, and the candidate is thought to be too pro-independence, Beijing might use that as an excuse to ramp up its assaults on the island, whether verbal or indeed economic or military. And of course, if the United States gets a new president in November of next year, basically coming into January 2025 for an inauguration, the Chinese will make an assessment as to whether that person is more or less likely to defend Taiwan. Although it must be said that unlike the question of Ukraine, where there is a real difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, the Democrats tend to be more consistent on Ukraine. When it comes to China and Taiwan, both Democrats and Republicans in the US tend to be pretty hawkish when it comes to Beijing.
Just a final question for you, Rana. I mean, you heard Tsai Ing-wen when she met with Kevin McCarthy there talking about, this shows that we're not isolated. How much support is Washington, other than saying that we kind of stand by your side, how much support would they actually be willing to give Taiwan?
Rochelle, I think they'll give quite a lot, certainly in terms of arms shipments. But for many American analysts, the key thing is that Taiwan has to ramp up its own defense of itself. It's increased conscription, national service there. It's increased its own military capacity. It will want to see Taiwan doing more work on its own before the United States calibrates exactly how much it's prepared to do in the face of any kind of Chinese assault.